forest conservation issues for since the early 1960s. We've been focused on expanding ecological forestry through ecosystem services markets for 10 or 15 years now, and have done a lot of work in the carbon space. And so, we see ecosystem service markets as one tool to help promote ecological forestry, and we're trying to, along with other groups like the Guild, we're trying to find the right combination of market and policy incentives to sort of expand that ecological forestry practices across the landscape, and really make it feasible for a broader demographic of landowners. So up on the screen, you see a few things we've worked on. We've worked on practice-based carbon management approaches, which have taken off recently, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. We worked on a forest to human health initiative, which was really interesting. We have a report on our website about that if you're interested. We've worked with national policy groups, and we worked a good bit with key lawmakers in the carbon pricing policy in Oregon, the recent cap and trade that was being debated for the last couple of years. And then we've also worked to explore and pilot some innovative inventory methods, and I'm going to talk about those in a lot more detail going forward. But I guess just, as context, we really are focused on ecological forestry and see that as the best paradigm for getting our forests to the place they need to be to both mitigate climate change and be positioned to adapt to the changes that is going to bring. I have been focused a lot on non-industrial private landowners in the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast. And in no small part, well, there's a lot of non-industrial private forests in those two regions. They're also very naturally carbon-rich regions, which is part of the reason why I've been focused on those two areas. There we go. So forest carbon in the Northwest. The Northwest has some of the most naturally carbon-rich forests in the world, in the Coast Range and the Western Cascades in particular. Unfortunately, a lot of those forests are currently well below their ecological potential. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit just to give you some context in terms of how forests and forest age and forest carbon are correlated. So on the right, you see, and this is from FIA data, you see average carbon content on a CO2e per acre basis across ownerships in these various geographies. On the left, this graph represents an age class distribution by ownership in the Oregon Coast Range. And what you can see here from these two figures is that private forest lands in the Coast Range in particular are very heavily weighted toward these young age classes, with the vast majority of private acreage being under 50 or 60 years old. And then you can see the biggest age class in terms of acreage is 0 to 10 and then 20 to 30. So heavily weighted toward these young age classes. Now, if you look over on the right in this table where I've got highlighted, you can see that correlates to private forests in the Coast Range being down around 100 metric tons per acre. Now, these forests can sequester up to 600 or 700 metric tons an acre. And let me clarify that the carbon amounts I'm talking about here are above ground live carbon. So it's not total ecosystem carbon, it's carbon in live trees, and it's converted from tons of carbon into metric tons of CO2e, which is what most climate reports and that sort of thing are put out in. So it's just for ease of understanding how this relates to climate concerns and emissions goals and that sort of thing. So you can see Forest Service lands are in the Coast Range closer to 300, about 280, and then the Western Cascades are about 230, but you can see how much lower private lands are compared to those. and how much both are sort of below the ecological potential. Now, we wouldn't expect the average carbon content to equal the ecological potential, obviously. I think we would expect it to be closer to this Forest Service reserve or unreserved, and maybe a bit higher than that. But to continue on that, the culmination of mean annual increment is an important concept here to think about. And Curtis, in a lot of his research, developing the growth curves and that sort of thing for the Coast Range back in the day, he set the culmination of annual increment at about 90 to 117 years for Coast Range Doug fir. And that just, for those of you not familiar, that just refers to when trees are hitting their prime growing years, right? When they're putting on the most volume per year. So he estimated that to be around 90 to 117 years. A more recent study done by the Forest Service and looked at a wider range of geography, found that around 127 years, give or take, forest had sequestered about 75% of their potential carbon. So you can see that's sort of the prime years in there, somewhere in that range from 80 to 90 up to 120, 30 years. It's kind of where forests are hitting their prime sequestration years, according to the studies and work I've done. That's going to be important as we go forward in this talk. So strategies for increasing forest carbon stores. The first one, as Xander was talking about, is really just keeping forest as forest. That's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, forests, they do sequester a lot more carbon, no matter what state they're in, than a parking lot or a condo or what have you. So keeping forest as forest is very important in terms of forest carbon. And then extending harvest rotations. Currently in the Coast Range, Doug fir, I think the average rotation is around 40 years. And as we sort of saw from the previous slide, that's only really starting to get into the prime carbon sequestering years of those forests. So extending those harvest rotations can have a big impact on how much carbon is being stored on the landscape, as can increasing harvest residuals, reserves, stream buffers, that sort of thing, leaving more carbon in the forest. And really, I mean, that's not complicated stuff, right? We're talking about leaving more carbon in the forest longer, increases forest carbon stocks. No huge surprises there. Of course, this does have implications on timber supply, and a lot of people are curious about that. Bevlaw at Oregon State and some others did a study that estimated extending those rotations from 45 to 80 years would decrease carbon harvested off private lands by about 7.3 million metric tons a year. That is not insignificant at all, considering that Oregon's overall gross emissions, I think, for 2016, I think they were close to 60 million metric tons a year. So that's a significant amount, right? 7.3 million. They figure if all private lands in Oregon were to move to such a rotation, it would result in about a 26% decrease in short-run harvested volume compared to the previous decade. So obviously not, that's not an insignificant amount, right? 26% of volume is something that has to be considered, obviously. Multiple studies listed there by people like Jerry Franklin and Chad Oliver have indicated that moving these harvests to between 60 and 80-year rotations would increase carbon storage and timber yields over time, because you are capturing those prime growing years of the trees. And as Chad Oliver has told me on many occasions, it also results in a higher quality timber that you're eventually getting off the landscape. So basically, you've got some challenges there with infrastructure, with supply chains, and making that transition. If we were to decide that that's where we want to go, there would be a period of time where the industry would have to adapt, mills would have to adapt, and that's challenging for sure. We're not discounting that. It's a real thing. The same study by Diaz was talking about extending these rotations, was looking at how discount rates play into timber harvest in terms of dictating net present value and the way that's calculated. And he showed in this paper that modest carbon payments or timber premiums could extend that net present valuation out to 60 to 80 years, something like that, and talked about how that could be moved. And so that's one reason. And the other reasons that Xander talked about, helping family forest owners be able to keep their forest, be able to draw some revenue from it while maintaining the kind of forest aesthetic and forest health they want. All those reasons are why we're interested in helping this demographic of landowners access carbon markets. Unfortunately, there have been some pretty significant barriers to this point to entry for this class of owners, and some of you are probably familiar with these, but carbon projects are expensive to develop. They take a pretty intensive inventory, some pretty intensive modeling work, legal work. It's not an easy thing to develop these projects. So for that reason, it's expensive. A lot of those costs are somewhat fixed costs. And so for that reason, it's been mostly holdings of over 5,000 acres and really even larger than that have been able to take advantage of the market so far. The long time commitments are also obviously an issue for the compliance market in California. You're talking about 100+ years that you're committing to maintaining this carbon on your landscape, and you start to run into intergenerational dynamics and liquidity issues and all that sort of thing, and just a lot of uncertainty. And I mean, a lot of landowners I've talked to, their forest is kind of a hedge against financial uncertainty, right? They kind of have it as a bit of an insurance policy against unexpected expenses, and they're not eager to tie that up in a way that they won't be able to access that. Now, you can do a carbon project on your property and still allow for some harvesting. So that's something we have to work through with people to get that understanding that you're not necessarily locking up all your timber, but you're going to have to lock up a significant amount to make the project worth it. So it's definitely a consideration. The persistently low price of carbon has also been a real challenge, especially in the years we were executing this project. Carbon prices were generally below $15 a ton, and there's very strong demand for timber and strong timber prices. So the opportunity cost there was significant in terms of sacrificed revenue. And then again, it's, on looking down the road on the back end, the region sort of has a lack of milling infrastructure for large diameter logs that would result from longer harvest rotations and a shift in management. And that's a problem that is going to have to be addressed really before the model of the paradigm can shift. Luckily, there's some really smart folks working on that. Ben Hayes worked on a project with us looking at milling infrastructure, what would need to change, where it would need to be located to sort of accommodate for this kind of forestry. And we have a report on that if you're interested. And Ben, I believe, is he doesn't work with Pinchot anymore, but he's continuing to work on that issue. So, so yeah, that sort of brings me to the project itself. For those not familiar, a regional conservation partnership program is a farm bill program through NRCS. Now it's a standalone program where the NRCS partners with folks on specific geographies and proposals to try and get their conservation practices or innovative conservation practices into the landscape at a broader scale, and just tries to expand their impact beyond what they can do by themselves. So we started this program in 2015 to achieve 4 important goals in Western Washington and Oregon. And you can see the map there on the left that has the counties that we were working in highlighted. A big piece of this was trying to deploy that NRCS funding, right, for carbon inventories, and exploring ways in which the NRCS can get involved in helping facilitate family forest owners and family farm owners in taking advantage of these ecosystem service markets. And that's something that the NRCS is very interested in, trying to leverage that public funding to attract private investment. And so they were excited about this, and we are right now pitching a few other programs in the Southeast to try and do something similar, where we're using NRCS funding to try and tee up investable projects to really expand conservation across the landscape. Another goal was to use the carbon data we get from these inventories, so real current carbon data, to design management plan templates. And basically that's just including carbon as a facet that was explicitly analyzed in a management plan, and looking at how various silvicultural treatments would affect carbon stocks over time. And then we wanted to pilot this new inventory technology to see if we could lower the cost of inventory per acre. I'm going to talk about that a bit more here in a minute. And then we wanted to facilitate knowledge sharing amongst our partners, extension agents, local managers, landowners, et cetera, and try to add some more specificity and details to what people know about carbon markets. There's a lot of sort of general knowledge and guesswork, and a lot of people have heard about carbon markets to some degree, but aren't familiar with how they work. So we did a lot of outreach and presentations and just talking to folks about that. So these were our partners for this endeavor. Of course, the NRCS was a huge partner. I really can't say enough about them in this project. Obviously, the agency itself is great, but they can be a little challenging sometimes. But the folks in Oregon were absolutely amazing. Dean Moberg at the Oregon NRCS office, I think he's the RCPP coordinator in Oregon. He was really great to work with. Really interested in how the NRCS can help move the ball forward and prepare and adapt and mitigate for climate change. So really great folks over there. Everybody else was fantastic too. Northwest Natural Resource Group, EcoTrust helped us a ton. OSU, everybody it was a great group to work with. Some highlights, accomplishments by the numbers. We did a lot of landowner consultations, just talking to folks about the potential in their forest for a carbon project, what it might look like, how the markets work, what to expect, timelines, that sort of thing. We did the 21 of these monitoring reports, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which really kind of evolved into a sort of management plan in itself. We did 2 full-on carbon management plan sort of demos. We put together a training manual on how to do forest carbon inventories for service providers. We did 46 inventories and 53 assessments. The assessments were pretty cool. David Diaz at EcoTrust put together a tool that correlated if you had some basic forest stand data, we could plug it in and it would sort of find FIA plots or FIA tracks that were similar and find the carbon content there and sort of give you a ballpark estimate of what the carbon stocks might be on your property, to sort of help us prioritize parcels and see which ones might be worth it and which ones might not be worth a full inventory. The inventory findings were interesting. Sort of have a sampling of some of them here. The properties we inventoried ranged from as low as like 45 metric tons of CO2 an acre up to 690, which is pushing what's thought to be ecologically possible. We found that recovering properties were largely below the baselines. And I should clarify, on the right in this graph, you'll see the 2 blue columns represent the California Air Resource Board ecoregion baselines. So those numbers are supposed to represent business as usual sort of practices. It's interesting, they're a pretty good bit above what the Forest Service says are regional averages, but anyway, They have 141 tons an acre to the Coast Range and 121 for the West Cascades. So that's the baseline. You can only be paid for carbon that is above that line, right? So anything below that, they consider to just be business as usual, and you can't get paid for that. So we found that recovering properties, and those were properties that had been cut over and sold off, or cut over and not really managed very much since that, were largely below the baseline, ranging from 40 to 100 metric tons an acre. And then properties from 150 up to 300 to 400 were really generally well-stocked forest land that was just in good shape and had been managed well. The story with the phones. So Forest Carbon Works is a project developer, a subsidiary of Eco Partners out of the Bay. They built this smartphone that has a 3D printed laser on it that you can take plot measurements with. You can go in, you stand at Plot Center, and you take a bunch of pictures, and it measures the trees around you, and then it picks one to sample, and you go to that tree and you take some more specific measurements, and it deduces the size of the average tree and all that from that. It's an interesting method that I won't pretend to understand statistically. I had it explained to me several times, and it was way over my head, statistically speaking. But just from the technical side, we did have a lot of technical issues with the phone. The phones didn't seem to be able to really push the app very well. They crashed a lot. The cost, in terms of cost per acre to inventory, was reduced, I would say, a good bit, but it varied quite a bit too, depending on how well the phones were working. So I would say the results on that were a bit mixed, and I'm gonna talk a bit more about them here in a minute. But let's see. So we did have one property, the Raincloud tree farm. So I should say that our goal in this project was not to issue carbon offset credits. That was not. We were not trying to get a property through that entire process. We were really focused on those 4 goals that I mentioned earlier. One property owner, the Stewarts, did choose to pursue an improved forest management project all the way through the process. It was a 120-acre tree farm in Clackamas County. They have now, the inventory has been verified by a third party, and they have received their initial carbon payment. I believe at last I checked, they're still awaiting those credits to be issued by ARB, but that is the last step of this entire process. And when that happens, I believe this will be the smallest project in North America. So that's something. I'm kind of proud of that, but there were several things that I think made that possible on this particular parcel that might not be representative of a huge demographic of landowners. For one, the property has been managed by a professional forester for several generations. John Stewart, the guy who manages it now, was a career Forest Service employee. He really did an amazing job of managing the stand. It's extremely well stocked. You can see the stats over here in the right-hand corner. 690 tons per acre, just really beautiful stand of 100-year-old Doug fir, 100-plus-year-old Doug fir. The owners themselves are very dedicated to mitigating climate change. They see climate change as an existential threat to humanity. They really want to do everything they can to try to address that. They want this property to be an example. So they were willing to push through multiple years of bureaucratic hurdles, delays, setbacks, glitches, et cetera. And they were really dedicated to making it happen. So, and they were also willing to forego significant timber revenue, right, from this to do that. So kudos to them. It's great. I'm glad that we were able to do that. And hopefully it does encourage people to think about the way they're managing in terms of carbon, but I'm not sure that this is going to be, I don't feel like we really totally broke through the ice with that one just because of these sort of extenuating circumstances, but it is an important step in the process, I think, in moving forward. Sort of changing gears, but another interesting aspect of this project, which I think really became maybe the most interesting to me, was the carbon monitoring piece. So what we did was we partnered with Oregon State and NRG to measure the effects of various silviculture treatments on real forest carbon stocks, and then model that growth in the carbon and compared carbon to sort of timber outputs. And we inventoried, I think 20 properties, I said, in 2019, and compared that with historic data from the same forest to put together these models. We used FVS and with some calibration factors provided by EcoTrust. So what you can see on the right here is a stand in Lewis County, Washington, modeled with and without a treatment that took place in 98, I believe. And the green and orange lines represent the treatment with the treatment, and then the red line is modeled without the treatment. So what was interesting about this particular property to me was that this was one of the only ones we looked at and modeled that actually responded pretty well to a thinning. It was very heavily stocked, over 600 trees per acre in the beginning. And so the thinning did release some growth, albeit very slowly. And the stand was able to surpass the no growth or the no treatment scenario to sequester more carbon. This was one of the only properties that did that responded to thinning like that, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, the findings from this were pretty interesting. Only thinning the most overstock stands resulted in long-term carbon gains. Heavy commercial thinnings and frequent thinnings did not result in sort of a release of growth. So most of those ended up being carbon negative. Now, I realize carbon is not the only reason you manage a forest. You're thinking about timber quality. You're thinking about disturbance mitigation and all those kinds of things. And those are fully legit reasons. But I'm just, from a carbon perspective, this was kind of interesting. So this graph on the right over here is a stand of Doug fir, 130 acres in Washington County, Oregon. We looked at 4 or 5 different scenarios for these properties in Washington County. We looked at several, I think 9 or 10, and we modeled this way. And of course, here you have in the green, you have a grow only scenario. Then you have 2 long rotation full harvest scenarios, one with more intense thinnings and one with lighter thinnings. And that's the yellow and the orange. And then you have 2 scenarios where you're transitioning to a multi-age stand. And one of them, the blue one, it had a harvest in year 0, which is why it starts lower than the purple one. But you can see how those thinnings affect the growth rates and carbon storage and all that. Obviously, FVS doesn't put in disturbances unless you trigger them yourself. So this is assuming no disturbances, right? So take it with a grain of salt, but I thought this was pretty interesting. Some of the things that came out of this were across all the properties, it took about 15 to 20 years to recover sequestration rates. And really you're talking about growth rates there. After a full harvest. So for the first 10 years or so, you really had no carbon sequestration going on whatsoever. And you can kind of see that down here in this graph. After the harvest, it really takes a while for the stand to recover and start to get that growth rate back. It took about 20 or 25 years to surpass the pre-harvest growth rates, and that would be somewhere in here, I believe. So you do have a period where these stands, these younger stands, are growing faster than the older stands, but you can see that it's not recovering that carbon or anything close to it. So then at 50 or 60 years, which is not on this graph, it would be out here somewhere, you would recover the pre-harvest levels. Now, this is for a long rotation harvest, so you can imagine a shorter rotation, a 40-year rotation harvest would be even more dramatic in terms of its historical carbon deficit. But what was interesting about these scenarios that we modeled here is you did end up, at the end of the model period, you ended up around 300 metric tons an acre, which is pretty good, right? Going back to those tables we saw before, that would be well above what the private average is now. And this scenario yielded significant timber revenues off this property as well. So maybe not a bad option. These others, we also have the timber outputs from those if people are interested. But just an interesting exercise. So I guess just to sort of wrap all this up, barriers for market entry remain for family forest owners. A lot of strides are being made, I believe, in terms of bringing down the cost of inventory and measuring. I think remote sensing is probably where this is all going to go. There's been a lot of strides just in the last couple of years in terms of remote sensing inventory techniques. So I think that's really where things are headed. There's some really promising programs being piloted right now looking at that. Likewise, in the aggregation realm, people have been talking for years about the potential of aggregating smaller landowners into larger projects to scale it up and make it work financially. Excuse me. And that's been a really difficult egg to crack for various reasons. I think there's significant strides being made on that right now. Several of the registries have modified their protocols to make it a little bit more feasible to do that. And one of those protocols is being piloted right now by the Vermont Land Trust, and I'll be watching that with a lot of interest to see if they're able to sort of pull that off and make it happen. The Institute is also putting together a project in the Southeast to pilot some of those aggregation protocols. Likewise, the Nature Conservancy and AFF are piloting a pay-for-practices approach in Pennsylvania right now that's really promising, really interesting. You can find more information about that on the web. And then, these barriers to transitioning to a longer rotation forestry are still there, right? And carbon protocols are kind of one of those because if we go back and look at this long rotation scenario here, this scenario would not be eligible for a compliance market carbon project, even though you end up above the baseline, which is this red line. You can't do a full harvest. That's called an intentional reversal. So I'm not necessarily saying they should include that, but I think having shorter time periods for carbon projects is something that has a lot of promise because it can promote longer rotation without excluding the possibility of harvesting, right? So voluntary markets are great. We talked about the California market, which is the compliance market, the only compliance market in the US. The voluntary markets have suffered from lower prices and then have traditionally been so low that maybe they haven't really even been worth it for a lot of landowners, but demand was really growing fast and thus the price was growing. Before COVID hit us all, the airline industry had made some huge commitments to buy offsets, which could have driven up the price. But of course, we'll just have to see where all that goes with this COVID-19 thing. but I think it'll come back. I think there's a lot of promise. I think really important strides are being made, and things have come a long way just in the past few years. So I really look for this to get a lot more traction in the next couple years. And I think within 5 years or so, we'll see a lot of smaller family forest owners be able to take advantage of this as a way to transition toward ecological forestry, which is great. That's all I had, Xander. So I can take some questions, I guess. I don't know how you want to do the question and answer period here.
Yeah, well, first I just want to thank you. That was a great presentation, and I appreciate you kind of connecting a lot of the dots, you know, from the AFF TNC project you just mentioned to, you know, all the I don't know, Forest Service research, et cetera. There are a lot of elements here, and you did a nice job pulling them together through the lens of this particular project. So thank you.
Great.
We do have some questions, and I think I'll go back here to the top. So let's see. You sort of touched on this, but maybe to bring it out more explicitly, the profits from selling lumber, from timber, obviously they're higher than carbon in the forest you're talking about. Did you, and you touched on this a little bit, but did you have sort of explicit calculations about potential lost income or that sort of thing from even just extending rotations?
Yeah, so modeling the economics of it is a little tricky because the uncertainty of future prices, but we did put specific numbers to the opportunity cost. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't remember those off the top of my head, but it was very significant for the Stewart property. It's difficult to convert. Like if we say, okay, this stand has 400 tons of carbon an acre, it's very difficult to convert that to board feet, right? Like most people are used to seeing a stand talked about in terms of how many board feet it has. Well, because so many other considerations go into board feet other than volume, it's kind of hard to translate that directly into carbon. But we did try, and I do have in our full report, which I can make available to anybody who's interested and contacts me. It's not published quite yet, but those numbers are in there in that full report.
Okay. And are you guys going to put that out publicly sort of in the near term?
That's the hope, Xander.
Okay. When you do, definitely let me know, and we'll make sure it gets into Across the Landscape, because I think that'll be really interesting. It's I don't know, it's great to get the presentation, but being able to refer to some of the detailed numbers is often handy. So I'll look forward to that. No rush though. Let's see. So Robert Turner pointed out that from a net present value perspective, annual revenue, as opposed to the periodic revenue from a timber harvest, can have a big impact. I also would imagine there's a sort of psychological or consistency benefit of a landowner. Was that something that kind of came up in some of these conversations, Josh?
It did, and Diaz has looked at that. David Diaz has looked at that a good bit in his work, and how that annual income can help move that needle. I would suggest looking at that paper of his from 2018. Most landowners we worked with and talked to were not accustomed to receiving annual income from their forest property. And so while that was appealing, the long-term time commitments and the restrictions sometimes outweighed that and sometimes didn't, right? It just depended on the landowner and what they wanted to get out of their forest and the possibilities they wanted to keep open in the future. Obviously, without going through a formal valuation process, everybody values having future options to some extent or another, right? And the value that some people put on those future options might be a lot higher than others.
Yeah, that's just a personal choice.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt Provencher, who's the DNR stewardship forester for Western Washington, didn't know about the RCPP and mentions that he could help steer landowners towards the EQIP funding. And I guess maybe building on that, what's the current status? So within EQIP, is this still available, or what's the current status, Josh?
No, Matt, I'm sorry you didn't hear about it. We did talk to people at the NER about this, but we obviously could have done a better job of outreaching there. But no, the program ended in December, so it is now complete. The NRCS is very interested in continuing. We're just kind of trying to figure out what that looks like. So I think very soon that will become a normal thing for the NRCS to fund those kinds of inventories and trying to set up these kinds of projects. But there are some hurdles that remain to be crossed. But yeah, the RCPPs are for defined time periods, 3 to 5 years, and that one is now concluded.
Okay. Robert Turner also asked about including the harvested wood products in sort of long-term carbon analysis. And I guess that's sort of outside the range of the voluntary market, but did that figure in at all in your assessments?
Yeah, we did figure that in for these scenarios. I don't know if y'all can see my pointer.
Yeah.
For all of these, we added back in 23% of all the carbon that was removed. And we used 23% as a number that Mark Harmon promotes as like average percentage of volume that's removed from any given harvest in the Northwest that goes into long-term wood products. So in the full analysis for all of this work that's in that report, we add back in 23% of what is removed from these. So these scenarios are presented in terms of economics and carbon, and for the carbon we add back in, it's what's on the stand and then what's in the products, and they still fell way below the grow only scenario, but that's we did consider that.
And did I say that right, that carbon stored in solid wood or any wood products would not be eligible for the voluntary market credits, right? You don't get credit for that, or could you? Was that included?
No, is the short answer.
Yeah. Okay. And we have a student on the line who said carbon markets seem to be on the cutting edge of forestry, and do I need to get a master's degree to get into this line of work? And I think we probably have quite, in addition to Josh, other folks who work in this field. So I think it would be great if people could weigh in, if you consider yourself somebody who works in carbon markets and forestry, any career advice for Cord or other students, please put it in the chat window, because I think that's a great question. And Cord had another question about sort of adaptation that I'm going to come back around to, because it's kind of the next stage beyond carbon sequestration. And Marissa asked if you could say why shorter contract lengths are better for encouraging longer rotations. Is it because landowners can complete their project before their harvest schedule?
Yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it, is that you're basically paying people to extend their harvest rotations rather than paying people not to harvest carbon at all. There's a lot of work on this topic on carbon rental. If you Google around looking for carbon rental schemes, you'll probably find some interesting white papers and such. But yeah, basically shorter term contracts could encourage a particular kind of forestry, right? And a particular type of harvest regime and harvest rotation that might be a lot more realistic for folks than trying to hang on to that carbon in perpetuity.
Yeah, certainly it's a different request of somebody or family conversation if it's a family forest when you're talking about X number of years versus perpetuity.
Yeah,
so
I think 40-year terms are fairly common in the voluntary market. And I think forest owners are used to thinking in 40-year terms, right? That's not crazy. Thinking about 100, 125 years, that's like people are kind of glaze over.
Yeah, the uncertainty starts to be pretty big. Let's see, and Todd asked if you could speak to how you think the results of the modeling and management practices could look different if using a model that incorporated climate change, something like climate FES, assuming climate stationarity and a lack of disturbance and climate risks when looking out that 100 years we were just talking about is going to give a different answer than the reality we're facing with likely increased disturbances.
Yeah, that's a super fair point. Yes, if I knew how to use the climate extension on FES, I would.
Well, and also part of that would be whether the voluntary, I mean, essentially that's in some ways reducing your business as usual case, right? So you'd have to get a little buy-in from others that was the increased disturbances were an acceptable modeling framework too, right?
Yeah, and I guess I'm not looking at these graphs like literally at all, but to me they just demonstrate the growth rates, right? Possible growth rates. This is not what you would actually experience, but within some variation, this is what you would probably experience, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it's just showing trends, if you will, across management scenarios, which there seemed to be some confusion about in the whole conversation about whether short rotation forestry was maximizing carbon benefit.
And thinking about some of the bringing in the climate change aspect, I think kind of touches back to a question earlier about the sort of viability of Douglas fir in places like the Willamette Valley, and thinking about, well, do you need to transition to other maybe more drought tolerant or warm temperature species like ponderosa pine? And I'm guessing that, Josh, you didn't even dip a toe into that kind of adaptation, but did it come up at all in your work?
No, not really, not to that sort of level. I mean, I've read some stuff on that, but no, it's not really, wasn't really a part of this project.
Yeah, it seems a little bit out there still. Not quite something everyone's talking about yet. Let's see. So, getting back to my questions, Siobhan asked about whether the TSP Training Manual that you developed for the program was publicly available.
Yes.
So maybe I'll get that the link or whatever from you, Josh, and I'll send it out when I send out the recording to this webinar to everybody, so we can share that, because it sounds like it'd be useful.
Okay, that'd be great.
And Richard asked, what carbon prices per metric ton are you hearing about now? Just sort of throwing out some numbers, giving people some benchmarks.
I mean, compliance markets were still hovering around $15 an acre. With voluntary markets, it's an agreement. It's a purchase agreement between a buyer and a seller. So it's really whatever they agree on. Benchmark prices were around $6-7 a ton, but it really varies pretty widely from very low to around the same as compliance prices. Obviously, those prices need to come up a good bit before they'll start to really move the needle on behavior.
Would it even be fair to say that you said $15 a ton? I mean, I guess I remember thinking $30 a ton was maybe more likely to be useful. Is that sort of after having been through the ringer on some of this stuff? Obviously, any increase would help, but does it have to be that dramatic to double?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. I mean, some analysis I did, and this was a couple of years ago when I think stumpage for Doug fir was at $350, or something around that. We figured carbon would need to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 a ton to be on equal playing field. I don't think it necessarily needs to be on an equal playing field to be competitive. But obviously, to see a massive shift in behavior, that's what would probably be needed.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting towards wrapping up here. Let's see, a couple good comments on what to take in school if you're interested in following a kind of carbon forestry track. And let's see, I guess, yeah, so we probably have time for, I don't know, maybe one last question. And I think everyone can unmute themselves. Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourself. So if you want to just ask a question, if you're a slow typist like me, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a last question here. And while we're waiting, if someone can butt in or type in, I will say that I think that, as we sort of pointed out, that this carbon forestry sort of, or carbon markets in general, continues to provide a real hope for promoting ecological forestry, which of course is the Guild's mission and shared mission with organizations like the Pinchot Institute. So I think that as other examples and models come out, or opportunities, we'll continue to share them. And I'd urge folks on this call, if you know, when we have some final results from that Vermont Land Trust project, we may try to do another webinar. But if you see anything useful coming out around this topic that you feel your colleagues would benefit from, or if there are new projects in development, it does feel like something that will help us all in the work we do, and of course mitigate some of the climate disaster we're all facing. So good. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions, so I think we'll just wrap it up right here. And Josh, I really want to thank you again. You did a great job, and clearly a lot of work went into the project itself in addition to just today's recap. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on, Zainer. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. And I'll share a recording of this, and you can share it with your colleagues or folks who missed it. So I'll end the webinar here and hope to see you on some future webinar.
Okay.